Uraraka is most certainly a fan favorite character when it comes to My Hero Academia, and she was designed to be just that from the very beginning. Likeable, as she is of course the heroine or main female lead of the story. With the start of the series and Deku's entry into UA, Uraraka was his very first friend at the school. She saved him from hitting the pavement after he overused his quirk, and even vouched for his entry into the academy when he received no points. She is a sweet and bubbly character with a surprisingly competitive nature at times, a desire to make others smile, and a drive to be a great hero similar to Deku himself. But what if she didn't? What if Uraraka didn't desire to be a hero, and was instead a villain? Now, first and foremost, like any good hero, a good villain is one of burning convictions and a reason for doing what it is that they do. In the case of Uraraka, her reason for being a villain would be a simple yet effective one: money. One of the most common reasons for anyone to stray from the path of righteousness, even in our world, or actually especially in our world, would be money. And a villainous Uraraka would be no different, as a part of her reasoning for becoming a hero is also monetary gain. Throughout her entire childhood and even now, Uraraka's parents struggled financially, to the point where she was quite perceptive of it despite having only recently manifested her quirk at around 4 or 5 years old. This is something that certainly weighed heavily on her, as despite her quirk being readily equipped to help them with their construction business, they refused to have her do so. In the story proper, she decided to become a hero and eventually be able to help them out, as heroes make quite a bit of capital seeing as they are at the forefront of society and all. But what if things were more pressing? Maybe eviction or an accident on the job made the need for money far more desperate. In that case, several years as a student, then several more as a potential sidekick, only to emerge as an independent hero with a low popularity rank would not be an acceptable course of action. It would just take way too long. And so if Uraraka couldn't help her parents directly, then she would be inadvertently pushed towards doing so indirectly, potentially destroying buildings entirely to create work for her parents. Now, these locations would most likely be in close proximity to their established place of work, making her targets a bit more predictable and dangerous on her end. Luckily for her, however, her quirk Float would be spectacular for leaving the scene of the crime quickly, making her that much harder to apprehend. And honestly, in most cases as a hero, you probably wouldn't want to catch her. Why? Because Float is an absurdly lethal quirk, one that is for the most part curbed and restrained by the character's heroism and conscience. In the hands of a character without morals, Float is virtually a one-touch killer. Maybe not immediately, but swiftly for sure. Upon closing that distance and making contact, Uraraka can make someone or something weightless by nullifying the effects of gravity on them. From there, she could very easily elevate a person high into the air and release to have them plummet to their death in a matter of seconds. Alternatively, she could have a person float indefinitely, rising further and further into the air. At an altitude of around 15,000 feet and beyond, most people would lose consciousness entirely due to a lack of oxygen and would eventually die. And with no distance or time limit on her quirk, just a weight one, even if a person required little or no air to survive, she could just have them float up to about 62 miles until they end up in space and just continue to float without her intervention. Which is just horrible. Now, mind you, with this villainous continuity, Uraraka would have never undergone any heroic training and thus would have never learned gunhead martial arts, which has been a very useful addition to her toolkit. But arguably, with the capacity to learn that to such an extent so quickly, I'd imagine that she could do the same with another fighting style if given the proper chance. More than that, in relation to her quirk, I believe we have received more than enough cases to conclude that unrestricted quirk usage generally allows for a better grasp of one's abilities. It's to the point where an uncompromising villain can compete and even excel beyond a formally trained hero. so she'd probably end up around a similar place, if not better. Now, if making a person float is too much trouble, making extremely heavy things float and fall would be her best bet. And yes, she does have an upper weight limit to her quirk, but really, if elevated high enough, she wouldn't even need them to be all that heavy, as at a certain height, the velocity to which something would rain down would be devastating and more than compensate for the item's inherent weight. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes in fiction, the more messed up a villain, the better. And so besides the death and damage aspects, I'd like to turn our attention to a means of torture. Let's say, for instance, Uraraka takes a person prisoner. She wants to extract some information out of them, or simply just wants them to suffer. Well, her quirk is pretty perfect for that. Make a person float and leave them just like that. At first, it's not much of an issue, but eventually, in a matter of hours, a person would likely undergo something known as space adaptation syndrome, a sort of space sickness that causes nausea, headaches, vomiting, vertigo, lethargy, and general discomfort. Furthermore, they would then experience a slowing of the cardiovascular system, a weakening of the immune system, loss of body mass, difficulty sleeping, decreased production of red blood cells, vision problems, wounds take longer to heal, and plenty more. It is just an onslaught of conditions that all originate from a single touch. Now that is downright diabolical. I think Uraraka would have the potential to be a great villain. Her reasoning would go from just to morally corrupt really fast, and to avoid suspicion and discovery by her parents, would only be made to go to even further lengths to keep her secret a secret. But at least then, her ever-growing collection of Jordan sneakers would be justified. But there you have it, friends, Uraraka as a villain. Midoriya Izuku is of course the main character of My Hero Academia. This is a guy that from as early as the age of 4 dreamed of becoming an incredible hero one day. Someone who could follow in the footsteps of the symbol of peace, All Might, and bring safety and smiles to those in need. He is a character that never wavers in the face of certain adversity if the lives of others hangs in the balance, and continuously hones his body and skills in order to be the best he can possibly be as the 7th possessor of One for All. But what if he didn't have One for All? What if rather than embarking on the path of heroism we know, he instead turned to villainy? This is a contemplation many fans have had over the course of the series, and so with our series of hero and villain role swaps, I think it's about time we provided our take. And of course, as such an inherently heroic character, it's certainly quite the shift, but it is really fun to consider. But how exactly would someone so enthralled by heroism end up walking down the complete opposite path? Well, if he never had the chance to prove himself to All Might, he would have never been offered One for All. And with that, his first and only conversation with his hero would be one where he was told to give up his dreams as someone without a quirk. A demoralizing sentiment that would only turn to further despair upon hearing of what happened to Bakugo on account of the slime villain. A villain he would know was able to do so because he had to be saved from it. All Might then losing the captured villain because of his actions. And I can only imagine that that overwhelming sense of powerlessness would manifest into extreme grief. Now, even in knowing himself to be quirkless, Deku still fully intended to shoot his shot with the UA entrance exam. Rationally speaking, this made no sense, but that just goes to show how great his desire to become a hero really was. And so even in the face of all this discouragement, I don't think that he would back down. But in the end, he just wouldn't make it, which would just end up being yet another layer of sinking discouragement. The best he could hope for here would be acceptance into UA's General Studies course, which would at the very least bring him a bit closer to the world of heroism he so desperately desires to be a part of. His documentation of quirk capabilities and hero techniques would intensify, and with that as reference, he would begin training. Maybe at first to fill the void, feel like he's working towards something, but eventually he would be, because even if nobody else thinks it's possible, he would prove them all wrong. And with that mentality, Deku would begin his journey as a vigilante. And maybe a vigilante isn't technically or inherently a villain, but in this superpowered society, the act is illegal and frowned upon. Unsanctioned quirk usage or abuse is considered an act of villainy. But as someone without a quirk, Deku would probably be underestimated or overlooked for quite some time. And from what I imagine, he would pretty much be your textbook hero being caught between legality and actual justice with a secret identity to boot. With his quirk, Deku tends to mirror some of the most famous heroes in Western comics, but without it, we're left with Batman parallels. And lest we forget, this is a world chock full of gadgets known as support items. Now, they are typically used as supplemental additions to already capable quirks, but Deku would more so use them as primary assets. Support items are rather downplayed throughout the series, but I figure that that's simply because finding one that optimally interacts with one's own quirk is rather difficult. But hey, being in UA General Studies, Deku would probably be able to swipe away a few prototype or throw away support items and fashion them for himself. He would probably have to have them modified further as to avoid exposure, but nevertheless, it is a start. Furthermore, as a vigilante, Deku would have to be far more tactical and methodical than he is as a proper hero, as he can't just smash his way through things. At the start of the series, even when avoiding the use of his quirk and having only been training for a few months, he was able to get the better of someone like Bakugo Katsuki, an incredible combatant that's been taking names from the very beginning, so that should tell you something. Deku would need to observe his targets and pick apart their weaknesses and shortcomings. Information which could then be discreetly passed on to the professional heroes. And speaking of professional heroes, I'd imagine that many of them would find fault in his proceedings simply because they aren't recognized by the law, and maybe even send a message the Public Safety Commission would rather avoid becoming widespread. But like Batman, in knowing the ins and outs of what many pro heroes are capable of, he would have multiple contingency plans in place to defeat, or at the very least, escape them. Now, from the public's viewpoint, I can picture how inspiring a figure like this could be. Someone young fighting for what's right, even despite their own powerlessness, is a powerful message. Everyone loves an underdog, one that could touch the hearts of many. And maybe with that, similarly to the allure of Stain, people would seek to assist him in his various escapades, quirkless or otherwise. By going against the establishment in this way, even while fighting for the common good, they would be villains. But some would consider them true heroes. Now, this is to me the route wherein Deku managed to hold onto his ideals despite being on the run. But on the flip side, we have a concept where Deku is really and truly diabolical. In meeting his hero, All Might, and once again having his dream shattered, Deku would succumb to his despair and accept that he just simply cannot be a hero, no matter how hard he tries. However, he would know the truth about All Might that only a select few had access to at the time. With his curiosity now getting the better of him, Deku would desire to know what sort of villain could have possibly delivered such a mighty blow to the symbol of peace, All Might, that would have left him in such a sorry state. And in doing this research, in obsessing over the truth, he would eventually find it, and eventually find him. All for One. Now, All for One, in recognizing the boy to have been clever enough to have found him, and someone who knows All Might's secret, would entertain him. And despite being a dastardly villain, you can't deny that All for One is damn charismatic. He could offer Deku a quirk, likely with a price attached. Who knows what exactly this price would entail, but regardless, I'm sure it would lead to Deku's corruption in some way, shape, or form. He might also learn that All Might too was once quirkless despite crushing his dreams so mercilessly. But now being associated with All for One's successor, Shigaraki, Deku would be able to enter the school of his dreams at the cost of being everyone's worst nightmare. And man, let me just say, the potential arch-nemesis dynamic between him and Bakugo would be absolutely glorious. The idea of Deku being a villain is, like I said, a very fun one, and so I'm curious what you guys think would be the case and how you felt about my takes on the concept.